Oral questions. Questions orales. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, China has now formally arrested Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. We don't know where these two men are being held, and they are at risk of being put to death by the Chinese because of these trumped-up allegations. Clearly, the Prime Minister's approach to China is not working. When will he stop acting like a coward, pick up the phone, do something about this, because the very lives of Canadians...
The honourable member knows first that you can't do indirectly what you can't do directly, and so I ask her to withdraw the word and apologize.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw calling the Prime Minister someone acting like a coward. I withdraw that.
Repeats it again. The Honourable Minister of Official Languages.
These are the lives of Canadians that we're talking about. We shouldn't be playing politics about it.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, we strongly condemn the arbitrary arrest of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and continue to call for their immediate release. The minister is in close contact with their families. We have rallied an unprecedented number of partners around the world in support of Canada's position. Canada continues to express its appreciation to those who have spoken in support of these detained Canadians and the rule of law. Thank you.
Opposition House Leader.
Earlier this week, the House apologized to Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, but as of yet, the Prime Minister has not. We all know very well that the House apologizing is vastly different than the Prime Minister apologizing. We know the Prime Minister has no problem apologizing, though he's done so to Omar Khadr, convicted terrorists. So why in the world would he not apologize to Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, who has been wronged, maligned, and almost bankrupted by this Liberal government? When can he get...
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can rely on the independence of their institutions. We supported the motion recognizing the Vice-Admiral Norman for his hardship. We are looking forward to what the General Vance will do in his discussions. And contrary to the Conservatives, we on this side of the House trust our institutions.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've learned that military regulations are preventing Vice-Admiral Norman from speaking freely about what the Liberals have been doing to him over the last 3 years. Canadians deserve to know what the Prime Minister and his office did to Vice-Admiral Norman, but they won't know unless he's allowed to speak. Gee, where have we heard that before? Yeah. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister remove this gag order, or are we again going to see another person with honor and integrity being told by the Prime Minister to just sit down, shut up, and stay silent?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, committees work independently of the government, and we will await the outcome of their deliberations. With respect to the process, the Public Prosecution Service of Canada noted when it stayed the prosecution that there were no outside factors or influence that were taken into consideration. There was no influence, including political interference, in the decision to lay charges or suspend the prosecution. Any statement to the contrary is baseless and absurd. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, like his father, the Prime Minister has never recognized the importance of Quebec within Canada. His words towards our province are positive, but his actions show clearly that he is vindictive and small-minded. He has thrown the full weight of his government behind a coordinated operation to cancel the Asterix contract. Why? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is determined to strengthen the Royal Canadian Navy and ensure that it has the capacity it needs to serve Canadians. The Davie Shipyard is a major shipyard, and we acknowledge the expertise of its workers who delivered the Asterix. The Asterix is temporarily meeting our supply needs at sea, and thanks to this transition to the future fleet, the Royal Canadian Navy will be able to continue to fulfill its missions to train and to deploy for this country and abroad. The Honourable Member for Charlesbourg-Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, was the member agreeing in Cabinet to trying to cancel the Davy contract? This was the first decision made by the Cabinet. A good thing it didn't work. But can the Prime Minister understand why there has been a coordinated operation to destroy Vice-Admiral Norman? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, based on last week's decision, the prosecution of Vice-Admiral Norman was suspended. As the Director of the Public Prosecution Service confirmed last week, each decision was made completely independently. No other factor was considered in that decision, and there was no other outside influence or contact at the PPSC, including political interference in the decision to lay charges or suspend the prosecution. Any statement to the contrary is absurd.
For New Westminster Burnaby.
$47 billion. Those are the profits from criminal acts that were laundered in Canada last year under this Liberal government. Canada is now the snow-washing capital of the world, and epidemic money laundering increases housing costs, and Canadians pay the price. Liberals choose to do nothing but fake posturing. They deny the resources and tools to fight money laundering. The BC NDP government has taken a courageous stand and launched a public inquiry. Will the Prime Minister show some courage and initiate a joint public inquiry cooperating with the government of British Columbia?
Hello. The Honourable Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, in fact, our government takes the threat posed by money laundering and organized crime to Canada's national security and the integrity of our financial sector very seriously. And that's why in Budget 2019, Mr. Speaker, we brought forward new measures to improve the transparency of beneficial ownership, to add $68.9 million to the RCMP and $50 million to CRA's real estate audit teams. Mr. Speaker, there are many important measures that we're acting on, and that's why it's with some disappointment that the NDP voted against those measures.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, we learned today that money laundering in this country has now reached $50 billion a year. $50 billion. And so that the Liberals fully understand, that's about 10 pipelines worth. While the Liberals are asleep at the oil switch, the NDP government in British Columbia is showing leadership and holding a public investigation into the matter. Who do the Liberals want to protect now? Are they going to follow British Columbia's example and take real steps to put an end to this plague?
Honourable Minister of Border Security.
Mr. Speaker, let me first say how delighted I am to hear the NDP's newfound interest in money laundering. Because in Budget 2019, we created both the Action Coordination and Enforcement Team and a Money Laundering Centre of Expertise to strengthen financial intelligence information sharing with law enforcement, directly in response to conversations we were having with the government in British Columbia. We've also provided resources, as I said, to the RCMP, to FinTrack, and to CRA. We've added a new offence of recklessness in that legislation as an offence to the criminal code to facilitate prosecutions. And I look forward, now with the newfound interest in money laundering.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, after having been asleep at the switch, all of a sudden the Liberals are waking up. They're sounding the climate alarm. They're jumping up and down. They're rattling on and putting on a great smoke and mirrors show. This is the same government bought a pipeline with our money and gave millions of dollars in gifts to oil companies. That's Liberal hypocrisy at its best. These are the champions of blah, blah, blah. But what we need is action. That's what young people are asking for. Will the Liberals have the courage to do the right thing and stand up for our motion, support it, that is calling on lowering greenhouse gas emissions now? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, obviously we have a climate emergency, and that's why we have a motion before Parliament right now. I want everyone to stand up and say that the science is clear on climate change. Obviously, there is an emergency, and we need to fulfill our international commitments. We have a climate change plan, and we are going to tackle this while we grow the economy at the same time. We created 1 million jobs. Our economy is growing, and I hope that everyone will vote on in support of our motion to declare a climate emergency.
Mr. Burnaby.
The truth is, the Liberals are trying to ram through Trans Mountain, which will mean Canada provoking even greater climate change. Now, declaring a climate emergency doesn't mean responding with platitudes and pipelines. Tackling climate emergencies takes more than a fake price on carbon that excludes the big emitters. It takes leadership. Liberals spout platitudes and ram through pipelines. Why don't Liberals do the right thing? End subsidies for big oil and gas and abandon the massive emissions to come from the Trans Mountain Pipeline project.
Bravo. The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, it's always very challenging in this House. On the one hand, we have a party that doesn't believe in taking climate action, who attacks the price on pollution, pretending that we're not giving the money back, that we're taking action to reduce emissions while putting more money in people's pocket. On the other hand, we have another party saying it's a fake price on pollution. I don't really get it. Look, we've got a climate emergency. We need to come together and take serious action. We have to stop fighting, and we need to move forward together. That is the only way we will be able to tackle climate change. That is the only way we'll be able to grow our economy. We've got to come together as a country. We owe it to our kids.
Exactly.
Order. It seems that many members have lots to say, but I'd ask them, of course, to wait until they have the floor. And now the floor is going to the honourable member for Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are refusing to allow today's emergency meeting on the Vice-Admiral Mark Norman affair to be televised. Canadians deserve transparency, but the Liberals want to hide in the dark. Vice-Admiral Norman says he has a story to tell that Canadians will want to hear. Canadians need to be assured that the Prime Minister isn't orchestrating yet another cover-up. Will the Chair of Defence Committee do the right thing and allow today's meeting to be televised?
The Honourable Vice Chair of the Standing Committee on National Defence.
Speaker, as Vice Chair of the National Defence Committee, I'm disappointed that the Liberal Chair of the Committee from Colonial Lake Country is stubbornly refusing to accommodate requests from media to televise today's meeting. There's intense national interest regarding the unjust prosecution of Vice-Admiral Mark Norman, but the Liberals want to keep it in the dark. So much for Liberal transparency. It's starting to smell a lot like a cover-up.
Now, order. The honourable member for Selkirk Interlake Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, last night I asked the Minister of National Defence if he would finally apologize on behalf of the Liberal government to Vice-Admiral Mark Norman for the miscarriage of justice he suffered at their hands. The answer? Nothing. The documents the Prime Minister fought to keep secret were the very documents that vindicated Vice-Admiral Norman, and it could have happened months ago, but yet they still refused to turn them over to the court. If the minister truly regrets what happened to Vice-Admiral Norman, will he let the sunshine in, release the documents, and end this Liberal cover-up?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of National Defence. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Canadians can have full confidence in our legal institutions. This week, we voted in favour of a motion to acknowledge Vice-Admiral Norman's achievements and recognize his hardship, and we look forward to discussions with general events. There is a process that was followed, and we must respect the judicial process, contrary to what the Conservatives are doing, which is not respecting the process. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, the Royal Canadian Navy needs 2 supply ships. On February 27, 2014, a fire broke out on the HMCS Protecteur. On September 1, 2014, the HMCS Preserver made its last trip. The Navy has critical requirements that only Navy can meet. Today, still, the C-SPAN, or rather, why is the Liberal government, why did it try to cancel the Davy Asterix contract? The Honourable Secretary, Parliamentary Secretary, Mr. Speaker, thanks to our shipyard strategy, there are many jobs being created. Now, the Conservative government excluded Davy itself from shipbuilding. Our government has given more than 16% of a value of millions of dollars to Quebec businesses. We believe in the Davy shipyard, and we will continue to make sure that men and women in the Royal Canadian Navy need the equipment they do to do their work. That's exactly what we are doing by investing in our men and women. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Chicoutimi-Le-Fjord. Mr. Speaker, we're the ones who gave the contract, not them. Mr. Speaker, the Asterix was a resounding success, delivered on time and on budget by Davy. Yesterday, the Minister of National Defence was not able to confirm when the Royal Canadian Navy would be able to count on receiving its second supply ship. He also stated that he endorsed the Chief of National Defence Staff in his decision to suspend Vice-Admiral Norman. Why did the Liberal government not support a man who has defended the Canadian Royal Navy? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker. The question also included a question on Davy, and so I'm going to respond to that by saying, Mr. Speaker, that the Conservatives completely forgot Davy Shipyard. We have granted more than $1.5 billion in contracts to Quebec businesses, and we will make sure that the men and women of the Royal Canadian Navy have the equipment they need. Our government takes the advice of the Departments of Justice and the Royal and the Canadian Armed Forces in order to be able to make the best possible decisions on supply ships.
Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill.
Mr. Speaker, we know that it was an orchestrated effort by the Prime Minister to politically interfere in the Mark Norman case. Documents were withheld and redacted, code names were used to suppress information, witnesses were tampered with, and clandestine meetings were held where no notes were taken. The Prime Minister's own lawyer talked about the need to engineer the issues at stake. Will the Prime Minister apologize to Mark Norman and immediately return the Admiral to his job?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, once again, this week we supported the motion acknowledging the service of Admiral Norman and apologizing to his family, and it's the entire House that supported that motion. Now we await the next steps on the behalf of the Chief of Staff. And General Vance will be sitting down with Vice-Admiral Norman to speak about next steps. We respect the process, contrary to the Conservatives, who have been trying to undermine the process for years and undermine our judicial process.
Ridge's Richmond Hill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the prosecution may have been completely independent, but it's this government that was anything but. Canadians know that the Prime Minister was wrong to politically interfere in the Mark Norman case. Now Canadians expect the Prime Minister to say he's sorry. It's clear the Prime Minister did everything he could to punish Admiral Norman. From tarnishing his reputation to destroying him financially, the Prime Minister was unrelenting. So when will the Prime Minister, on behalf of the government, not this House, the government, apologize to Mark Norman and give him his money?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, once again, we accepted unanimously a motion in this House for apologies to Vice-Admiral Norman. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Director of the Public Prosecution Service said that there was no outside influence, no other factors were taken into consideration in the decision to lay the charges or stay the prosecution. That is the Public Prosecution Service that said that. And so any accusation of that is absurd. We all have to respect the judicial process. We will always do that on this side of the House, contrary to the Conservatives.
For North Island, Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, Kinkham, a community in my riding, has been going into debt every year because of this government's lack of action to get them off diesel. This community has been grappling with dangerous floods because of climate change. Like many communities across this country, they want action. Our motion asks the government to stop subsidies to big oil, not to communities like Kinkham. Liberals are misleading people by using their own failure to deliver for Indigenous peoples to defend against their lackluster record on climate change. So it's a simple question. Why are the Liberals refusing to support our motion to fight climate change?
Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
That's not how it reads at all. And in fact, we will remain on guard and work diligently with Indigenous communities as they make the transition from a diesel economy to a new economy. But in the meantime, we have to remain vigilant, and we have to make sure that we protect at least 24 Ontario communities that presently rely right now on that subsidy in order to power their water rehabilitation facilities and in order to power their schools. We will continue to work with First Nations as they, like the rest of us, make a transition to a new energy economy. Thank you. Thank you.
Honourable member for North Island, Powell River.
Well, this community is in British Columbia, Mr. Speaker. It is deplorable that the Liberals are using access to housing and the cost of living on reserves to defend their subsidies to big oil. It is unacceptable to see the government mislead people to protect rich corporations. New Democrats are talking about the more than $6 billion given last year to oil giants. And the Liberals are trying to claim that they can't cancel those subsidies because it would deny Indigenous communities basic fairness? Enough. When will they join us in fighting climate change and also make sure that no Indigenous community is left behind?
The Minister of Indigenous Services.
And I would say, Mr. Speaker, enough with legislation and policy being placated here in this House without consulting with Indigenous communities first. I would ask the NDP exactly how much consultation with Indigenous groups did they do before they decided they wanted to end subsidies, the federal energy subsidies. I would ask them how much consultation they've done. I know on this side of the House we continue to consult because the path to reconciliation requires all of us to do so. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government is unable to agree with the provinces on several files. The Minister of the Environment is constantly attacking the governments of Ontario and Alberta. The Minister of Tourism, whenever she can, is criticizing the government of Ontario. And the Minister of Families and the member for Louis-Hébert publicly attacked the Premier of Quebec. And so my question is this. Does the Prime Minister agree with this disrespectful and condescending way of doing things on the part of his members of Parliament and Liberal ministers? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, you really have to be a Conservative to be against projects throughout the country. This morning, I was speaking with my counterpart in Alberta. We are proud of having approved more than 4,000 projects throughout the country. We've invested more than $2.4 billion in the Atlantic region. We've invested more than $6.7 billion in Quebec, and we're proud of having invested more than $12.9 billion in Ontario, as well as $15.6 billion out west. And we'll continue to invest to improve the quality of lives of Canadians throughout the country. The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. What's unfortunate is that he picked up the wrong piece of paper to answer my question. Mr. Speaker, this government is paternalistic and condescending to our main partners, the provinces. Just imagine, the Prime Minister last Friday said that the Premier of Quebec was engaging in petty politics. That comment is disrespectful towards the person who was democratically elected by the people of Quebec last October. Does the Minister of Infrastructure agree with the words of his Prime Minister, who is being so disrespectful? The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, I do have a lot of respect for my colleague, but, you know, respecting Quebec, Mr. Speaker, means more than just asking questions in the House of Commons. It means acting in the interests of Quebecers. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, that since November 2015, we've approved over 600 projects in Quebec to a value of $5.3 billion. Mr. Speaker, respecting Quebecers means investing in Quebec, and we'll continue to do that.
L'honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Beauport-Limoilou. Order, please. Mr. Speaker, real Federalists do what we have done. We recognized the unique nature of Quebec. Mr. Speaker, several times since 2015, we've seen how the Liberal government is everything but transparent. It slips in questionable clauses into omnibus bills. And this year, the Liberals refused to properly fund the Office of the Auditor General. Why did they hold back the funds this office needed to fully conduct its audits? Because this government has to be accountable to Canadians. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With respect to officers of Parliament, we have no lessons to take from the Conservatives. We'll recall what happened in terms of unilingual Anglophone officers of Parliament. Under this government, This government has given our officers of parliament the tools they need. The OECD last summer said that from 2015 to 2019, a typical family of four has $2,000 more in its pockets. And that's what this government is doing for the middle class.
Member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this government will do anything to avoid accountability. We've seen them try to cover up the interference in prosecutions in the case of SNC-Lavalin and Mark Norman. Now the Auditor General says that his office cannot fulfill its mandate because it did not receive the funds it needs. And as a result, they've canceled 5 important audits. For 140 years, the Auditor General has helped hold governments accountable. Will the government commit today to end its culture of cover-up and fully fund the Auditor General's office?
Honorable President of the Treasury Board.
Our government is committed to supporting the important and ongoing work of our Auditor General. Where an officer of Parliament, such as the Auditor General, identifies the need for additional resources, we consider such requests very carefully to ensure that the office can continue its important work for Canadians efficiently and effectively.
The Honourable Member for Windsor West. Order.
With gas prices soaring, nothing protects Canadians from being gouged. A gas price monitoring agency was being established until it was destroyed by the previous Conservative government. And meanwhile, Canadians keep getting ripped off. Gas pumps routinely charge people the wrong amount of money, but when Canadians pump their gas, they want to know what they're getting for and they're paying the correct amount of money. And to make things worse, the pumps are rarely inspected. All the while, the industry racks up record profits and continues to get subsidies from the Liberals. Canadians are fed up. Why didn't this government finally protect consumers and restore the price monitoring agency?
Hear, hear. Honourable Parliament Secretary, the Minister of Finance. Order.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et je tiens à...
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to say that we've been working on protecting consumers Canada-wide, especially with respect to finances and consumers. We want to make sure that Canadian consumers are protected, and we'll continue doing so. The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Mr. Speaker, last year, advertising revenue for Facebook and Google totaled more than $5 billion. Despite this, these two companies didn't pay one damn penny in taxes. The Minister of Revenue said she was focusing on the big fish. Well, wakey, wakey, it's not for nothing that they're called web giants. While the government is twiddling its thumbs, our artists, our business, and our media are footing the bill. When will they put an end to this privileged treatment? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, and I thank my honourable colleague for the question. We've been working hard with international partners to deal with web giants to ensure that they pay their fair share. Mr. Speaker, this is not a uniquely Canadian problem. That's why we are working with our international counterparts and with groups like the OECD to come up with a consensus-based approach. We want to ensure that a tax system that is fair, that works for everybody. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to point out the consistent inconsistencies when it comes to the NDP and closing tax loopholes.
Order. I would ask the Honourable Member for Longueuil Saint-Hubert to not speak when someone else is speaking.
Mr. Speaker, 45,000 Canadians die of smoking-related issues each year. This amounts to 1 out of every 5 deaths in this country. Smoking-related illnesses cost the healthcare system approximately $6.5 billion every year. As such, I'd like to ask the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health, what steps is the government taking to reduce the use of tobacco products here in Canada, particularly amongst our young people?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague, the member from Mount Royal, for the question and his work on this important issue. Tobacco kills 1 Canadian every 12 minutes. That's why our government kept its promise to better protect Canadians, particularly youth, by introducing plain packaging and new regulations on vaping, with more to come. The Canadian Cancer Society calls our new regulations the best in the world. We will continue to protect our youth and all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte-de-Beaupré et d'Orléans-Charlevoix. Mr. Speaker, when the Finance Minister's Chief of Staff interferes directly in the SNC-Lavalin scandal, he's not called on the carpet. No, he's rewarded and promoted. And we've learned that he even threatened the former Attorney General's staff and tried to circumvent the rule of law. Why does the Prime Minister reward those who do his dirty work and fire those who stand up to him? The Honourable Mr. Speaker, as we've said many times, we respect our institutions and we know that they work independently of government. We have to allow them to do their work, but it's not the way of the Conservatives who continue to do petty politics with this. We will continue to work for Canadians. That's why we're here. And that's why we have a program that's working for Canadians despite the Conservatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister fired his Attorney General when she had the audacity or the courage to stand up to him. But Ben Chin, a key actor in the SNC-Lavalin scandal, he has been promoted as the senior advisor to the now Prime Minister. So let me get this straight. Under the current Liberal government, if you stand up to the Prime Minister, you get fired. But if you help the Prime Minister do his dirty work, no problem. You get a big promotion. My question is very simple. Does no one over there see the injustice and what is wrong?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, in Canada, the country that I'm proud to be born and raised in and to be representing, we have offices of Parliament and we have an independent court system, and they are functioning. We know that the rule of law is intact in Canada, and this has been said on numerous occasions. Canadians can have confidence in their institutions. We on this side have confidence in those institutions that work independently of government. But the Conservatives, they've always been used to undermining our institutions, and they've been used to making their patronage appointments, and that's why they can't fathom that they are working. And if they want to mislead Canadians, that is unfortunate.
Order. Order. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
At the height of the SNC-Lavalin scandal, Ben Chin threatened the former Attorney General's Chief of Staff, saying, "Your boss spoke to the Finance Minister yesterday and said that me and Elder were mucking around on this file. Be careful when using my name, Jess." I guess he wanted her to use code names. By mucking around on this file, what the former Attorney General meant was that Ben Chin was working to undermine our rule of law. Instead of firing Chin, like he did the former Attorney General, the Prime Minister promoted him. How is that right?
Yeah.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, what is right is that we have a rule of law that is intact in Canada. What is right and appropriate is to have confidence in our institutions. What is right and appropriate is to have confidence in our offices of Parliament. And that's exactly what we do on this side. The Conservatives under 10 years of Stephen Harper always continue to undermine the work of offices of Parliament. They did question and they continue to question the independence of our judicial system, and that is very unfortunate. And what's even more clear, Mr. Speaker, is that here we discuss government business, but the Conservatives will continue to smear names because they know those individuals can't be in here to defend themselves, and they take advantage of their privilege. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Chin was so aggressive to insert himself into the independence of our judicial process that the former Attorney General went to the Finance Minister and said, and I quote, "I told him that engagements from his office to mine on SNC had to stop and that they were inappropriate. They did not stop," she said, adding that her Chief of Staff subsequently received calls from Ben Chin on SNC-Lavalin and the need for a deal. What message does it send when someone who actively worked to undermine our rule of law is promoted and those who defend it, like the former Attorney General, is fired and kicked out of caucus?
Exactly. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, from the beginning, what we have always said is that Canadians deserve to get to know the truth, and that's exactly why the committee was able able to work independently of this place, and that's exactly why the Prime Minister waives solicitor-client privilege as well as cabinet confidence. Mr. Speaker, this is the first time that this has happened. It's unprecedented because you know what, Mr. Speaker? People should be able to speak for themselves. And we live in a country where we have a rule of law that's intact in Canada. Unfortunately, that member cannot handle having people speak for themselves because he feels that he needs to speak for them. But I think the former Attorney General was more than capable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hello.
Order.
Order. Order. The honourable member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek will come to order. And others. L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Trois-Rivières. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Cusson, President of the UMQ, asked federal leaders to choose between effective solutions to fight climate change, and the Liberals responded with a motion with no commitments. Now the NDP is proposing stopping TMX, eliminating subsidies to oil companies, and bringing back Jack Layton's bill on climate change. Mr. Speaker, will the Liberals acknowledge the soundness of our position and vote in favour of our motion? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, it's really interesting that their motion came only after our motion. Our motion is clear. It's not partisan. There are three things that we have to do together. We have to acknowledge that we have a climate emergency. 2, that climate change science is sound. And 3, that we have to meet our international obligations. I'm asking everyone in this House, vote for this motion. We have an emergency on our hands.
A member for New Westminster, Burnaby, to speak when he has the floor and not when he doesn't have the floor. The honourable member for Essex.
Thousands of Canadian winery jobs are in danger because this government refuses to act. We are running out of time for a WTO settlement with Australia. This finance minister knows that if he removes the escalator tax, he will save 9,000 direct grape and winery jobs and another 37,000 tourism jobs linked to the industry. This is simple. Remove the escalator tax and the WTO challenge disappears. Leave it in place and jobs are threatened. We are running out of time. Will the Prime Minister reverse the escalator tax to save Canadian wineries? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much, and I appreciate the question because it gives us another chance to actually talk about how our government lowered taxes for businesses. We've been investing in Canadians, and as a result, we've actually created 1 million new jobs. So, Mr. Speaker, it's hard to take the NDP seriously when they're talking about the economy because it seems like every day they change their position on various industries. But we on this side of the House have had a plan. Invest in Canadians, lower taxes for the middle class, for small businesses. As a result, Canadians are $2,000 better. A typical Canadian.
Order. The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals have woken up today and realized that there is a climate emergency. It's been 3.5 years they've been in power, and they realize they haven't done anything worthwhile to reach the Paris targets. I'm quoting the National Observer. Canada will fall short, far short of its 2030 targets. With the Liberals, Canada will not be able to honour its commitment within the context of the Paris Agreement. Will this government finally tell the truth? The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Mr. Speaker, what Canadians want to know is the Conservative Party able to understand that we have a climate emergency? Can the Conservative government understand that climate change is real and accelerating? Can the Conservatives realize that we can give money back to people? Do the Conservatives understand that our economy and our environment in the 21st century go together? This is what everyone wants to know. I would remind the honourable member that after having asked his question, he should stop talking. Order.
Alors.
Order.
The member for Abbotsford.
Day after day, the minister stands in this House and tells us that her so-called climate plan is working. And day after day, she is reminded by friend and foe that her climate plan is failing, that the Liberal government is falling far short of its Paris targets. Do you know why that is? It's because hers is not a climate change plan, it's a tax plan. And while she's busy forcing carbon taxes...
Order, order. Let's have one member speak at a time. Order. The Honourable... that should apply to all sides. The member for Abbotsford. Continue.
While she is busy forcing carbon taxes on Canadians, her plan is missing the mark by a country mile. When will the minister finally come clean and admit that her plan is not as advertised?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, we put a price on pollution. We're giving money back such that 80% of Canadians are better off, better than advertised. We've created a million jobs with Canadians, better than advertised. We're phasing out coal and ensuring a just transition for workers, better than advertised. But you know what is exactly as advertised? The Conservatives, because they're just like the Harper Conservatives. They have no plan for the environment, no plan for the economy.
Honourable member for Abbotsford. Order.
Speaker, earlier in question period, the minister admitted that she doesn't get it. Remember? Yeah. She doesn't get it, and she's right. The minister's own documents show that the Liberals are falling far short of the promises the Prime Minister made in the Paris Agreement. So we have another promise made, another promise broken. When will the minister drop this charade, stop trying to distract from Liberal failures and scandal, and admit that her plan is a complete failure, not as advertised?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, I want to take us back 3.5 years ago. We went to Paris to negotiate an ambitious Paris Agreement after a decade of inaction. Who was with me? The member opposite. What did we talk about there? We talked about how we needed to take serious action on climate change, how that needed to include putting a price on pollution, that we need to act for our kids, that we could grow the economy at the same time tackling climate change. He seems to have forgotten that. I'm happy to go out, have a drink with them, and remind them exactly what happened and how we can grow the economy, how we can tackle climate change, and we can all do it together.
Order. The Honourable Member for Long Range Mountains. Order.
Speaker, in 1949, my province joined Confederation as Canada's 10th province. And since then, it's been our constitutional right as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians to be guaranteed a connection to Canada's mainland. Eastern Canadian ferries are essential for tourism, for the movement of goods and services, and providing locals with an alternative source of transportation. Can the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Transport please advise my constituents and all those who rely on the ferry services how our government's plans are improving our connection to the mainland? Thank you.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member from Long Range Mountains for this question and, of course, for her advocacy on this file. Our government is proud to be delivering the first new ferry on this route in 30 years, Mr. Speaker. More than 70% of goods, 30% of people arrive via this service. It is crucial for Newfoundland, Mr. Speaker. And this $80 million investment will ensure that both tourism and the economy continue to prosper in Newfoundland for the benefit of future generations, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable.
How the Liberals are mishandling the Canola crisis, Mr. Speaker. The minister couldn't get a formal meeting with her Chinese counterpart. No delegation, no WTO complaint, no ambassador, and no advance payment program. Yes, the Canola Growers Association said to farmers it hasn't been implemented yet. Wow. The Liberals are taking no action. When will they have access to the help they need to get through this Liberal failure?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, we stand with our farmers from the very beginning, and I don't know where my colleague has been gone for the last 2 months and a half because apparently he missed a lot of it. I've traveled to the prairies. We have talked with the industry, with the farmers, with the provincial counterparts. We have created this working group. We have made a declaration at the WTO. I've traveled to Japan. I had a conversation with my Chinese counterpart. We are moving on this file and we take it very seriously.
I remind members that we don't bring attention to questions about the absence or presence of members. Honourable Member Windsor-Tecumseh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 15 months ago, this government promised that its ombudsperson for responsible enterprise, CORE, would be able to investigate human rights abuses committed by Canadian companies abroad. But these investigative powers are caught up in red tape, and it looks like it won't even open by the election. This government has a serious issue with corporate ethics and accountability, as the SNC-Lavalin scandal tells us. So this CORE office must be opened up and running by the summer. So will this minister follow up?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of International Trade.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my honourable colleague for her question. I am proud to be part of a government for the first time in Canada's history to create an office for social corporate responsibility. Our government has fulfilled our promise, and today we are consulting with stakeholders on the mechanisms that are needed. We recently announced the chair of the CORE office, and we are currently consulting, and I will look forward to the honourable member's support for that office.
Hear, hear. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Speaker, yesterday was the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Winnipeg General Strike. 100 years ago, more than 30,000 workers started the largest strike in Canadian history. It was a passionate fight born on the streets of Winnipeg for workers' rights and for better working conditions. Bread and roses, Mr. Speaker, bread and roses. Today we remember the progress we've made thanks to the Labour movement. Can the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Labour remind the People's House of our commitment to organize labour?
Oh, good question.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
I'd like to thank the member from Winnipeg Centre for the question and for his obvious passion about working on behalf of Canadian workers. With the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Winnipeg strike, I want to thank those pioneers for what they did. Mr. Speaker, unions matter. Unions represent people who work hard, support their families, and contribute to their communities and to the national economy. Unions fight for the middle class and have been a driving force behind historic progress made for workers. Our Prime Minister and our government, Mr. Speaker, we stand with workers today and every day.
Honourable member for Carlton Trail, Eagle Creek.
Mr. Speaker, the Senate Transport Committee is recommending that Bill C-48 be scrapped. After listening to provinces, industry, environmental, and Indigenous groups, they realize this bill is not in Canada's interests. Like the carbon tax, this bill is not about the environment. It is about ideology. Will the Prime Minister agree to allow this bill to die and not whip his Liberal senators into reviving this flawed legislation?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, our government is proud of the work that we are doing to make sure that we not only protect BC's pristine coastline, but we actively invest to restore it. Of course, we are disappointed by the vote. We hope that the Senate will vote to continue debate in third reading. We're open to any amendments that the senators have. We'll keep working with them as long as it's within the spirit of the bill.
The honourable member for Manicouagan. Mr. Speaker, the Bloc tabled a brief on Bill 21 at the National Assembly. Our message to Quebec's elected representatives is Ottawa is dying to fund a court challenge of the legislation on secularism. Through the court challenges program, will the Minister of Justice guarantee that he will not challenge directly or indirectly the bill on secularism in Quebec? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, our government has defended and will continue to defend the fundamental rights of each and every Canadian. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms protects rights, and we are the party of the Charter. Our position is clear. We will defend rights, but for the moment, this is a debate which will take place in Quebec by Quebecers. The Honourable Member for Miniquagon. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a clear answer. We in the Bloc, we're very clear. We are for secularism. We're for services provided for and received with an uncovered face. We're for prohibition of religious symbols for people in authority working for the state. But the chairman of the Justice Committee is waiting for Bill 21 to be passed to initiate legal proceedings. Will you, yes or no, respect the will of Quebec and not challenge the Quebec legislation on secularism? I would ask the Honourable Member to direct her questions to the Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, as I just said, we are the party of the Charter. We respect basic rights, the basic rights of each and every Canadian. There is a bill which is now at the National Assembly. We will honour that process, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. Yesterday in the House, the Minister said that he would work with Quebec and the provinces to ensure projects were approved in time for this construction season. Nunavut has a housing crisis that is contributing to high rates of poverty, suicide, and tuberculosis. The territory doesn't have reliable access to the internet. We need connectivity to educate our children and move our economy forward. Will the Minister extend the same courtesy, Mr. Speaker, to the Government of Nunavut and approve housing and connectivity projects in time for the summer construction season? Thank you.
Of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. First of all, let me say we were all pleased to see Nunavut winning the Smart City Challenge in the 10 million category, where they proposed a project which will leverage digital access to promote mental health across the territory. We're extremely proud to see our colleagues from Nunavut win that. But let me say that under the bilateral agreement, we will invest more than $566 million in Nunavut. We have already approved 21 projects, which represent about $333 million. We will continue to invest to improve the lives of people in the territories in Nunavut, create jobs, and create economic opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.